My name is Carlos Salinas. I'm the Executive Director of Healing Bridges, a Washington, D.C. based non-governmental organization that accompanies the traditional authorities of the Kofan indigenous people of the Colombian Amazon. I am from Chile and have been working with the Kofan people in one way or another for about 19 years. This is the story of how something I read late in high school about a plant and telepathy eventually led me into an epic struggle for social justice, for cultural sovereignty, and for indigenous survival. This is also about how by meeting the Kofan where they were and in their own terms, we began building real relationships, not necessarily kinships, but certainly kindness. And together, insisting on love, we have built a common road that is full of laughter and joy. I believe that together we build, if not recognize, the kingdom. I first heard of a calling when I was in elementary school, and I imagined that this was a moment filled with angelic choirs and beams of light. Instead, I now realize that in my case, it was simply a phrase I could not shake. Joseph Campbell would call it following your bliss. In other words, following that nudge, which when you do, makes you profoundly happy, knowing that everything is all right. That's not the same thing as being excited. It's a profound sense of happiness. Of course, we could temper this with a quick Ignatian test. Does that feeling move us towards God or away from God? So in my case, that phrase I read led me into the Amazon, and as I look back, I see a lot of other inflection points. It is true, one thing does indeed lead to another. But first, let me tell you about the Kofan indigenous people I know. I only know a little bit about the Kofan who live in Colombia. There's another population in Ecuador. In Colombia, the Kofan are a people in danger of extinction. And while the Kofan have many unique characteristics, such as a language that seems to have no known linguistic family relatives, the Kofan are similar to so many other peoples who have been oppressed through time and space. There are people who, along with their part of creation, Amazonia, they are treated as nothing more than objects for the enrichment and pleasure of others. The Kofans are ensnared in the stranglehold of the monetary economy, subjected to the poisonous whims of the oil industry and other decisions made about them in their absence in distant capital cities. Despite enormous pressures against their indigenous identity, many Kofan maintain their customs and practices, at the heart of which is the ceremony of traditional indigenous medicine, the ritual drinking of their most sacred plant, yaje. You might have heard of it by the name of ayahuasca. They call their ritual the toma de remedio, in other words, the drinking of medicine. Most Kofan are Catholic, and the tomaderos, the ceremonial houses, often have a crucifix and assorted iconography, statuary of Christ, the Virgin, the saints, as do their homes. Their everyday speech often refers to God's will or God's help. Their everyday speech never takes the Lord's name in vain. The use of curse words and yelling from anger are pretty rare. Boisterous laughter instead is the rule. When I first visited this part of Amazonia in 1986, Don Pacho, may he rest in peace, the first medicine man I ever met, told me that the yaje vine sprang up from the hairs that fell from Christ's head as Christ walked the earth. I assumed Don Pacho only said that to protect his beliefs from church and state. Indeed, both had persecuted men like Don Pacho and their beliefs. And as if to underscore that point, a nun who was visiting Don Pacho's community when I was there, in front of everyone, called the yaje tradition the work of the devil. I thought at the time that the Christianity that men like Don Pacho espoused were thin protective veneers, but over the years I came to appreciate how rich their belief systems are and how they truly embrace both worlds of thought and belief. Leading the ceremonies of traditional medicine are the curacas, the traditional authorities, men who have completed apprenticeships lasting decades. Usually, they cannot be considered curacas until they're at least 50 years of age. They learn from and through the yaje. They use the yaje to cure illnesses of body, mind, and spirit. The yaje often allows them to have a common vision, a simultaneously shared thought, and they often explain that each people's has a distinct thought, un pensamiento. In the past, all Kofan people participated in the ceremonies. As the Kofan came into increasing contact with the modern world, with the colonists and their tools and toys, the younger Kofan began abandoning the ceremony and their pensamiento. They saw the ways of the colonists as more attractive, or perhaps they saw traditional medicine's helplessness in the face of new diseases that arrived with the colonists or that sprung up from the forest as it was decimated. The worst part of the Spanish conquest came not from the sword, but from disease. Successive waves of extractive fever swept through the Kofan world. First, our thirst for gold, then our thirst for rubber, and then for the last 50 years, our seemingly unquenchable thirst for oil. First the Spaniards, then the Peruvians, and the last 50 years, the United States and Colombia. It was Texas Petroleum Company, now Chevron, that first began extracting the oil from under the feet of the Kofan in the 1960s, unleashing this death spiral that still grips the Kofan to this very day. This is the period of time with which I am most acquainted, especially in the Kofan territory called Santa Rosa del Guamués. The Guamués River and its valley burst with illicit coca cultivation in the 1980s and 1990s, attracting the violence of drug traffickers, but also armed opposition groups and the government's paramilitary allies. Fierce counterinsurgency warfare ensued. Criminal and political violence exploded, and it became the epicenter of President Clinton's Plan Colombia and the wonderful opportunity for Sikorsky Aircraft of Connecticut and Bell Textron of Texas to reap millions of dollars of taxpayer dollars so that the United States government could send helicopters to the Colombian army. The warfare left in its wake hundreds from massacres and those extrajudicially executed or disappeared. The Kofan of Santa Rosa during this time suffered 3 disappearances, 3 men who were abducted and never heard from again. One of their widows described to me how her search took her from army base to paramilitary encampment, never to find her beloved, but instead she was met with threats and abuse. One of the other disappeared men was the reason I stopped asking children in Santa Rosa who their father or mother was, because one of them told me, lo mataron, they killed him. Another Kofan miraculously survived an assassin's bullet, and her late parents told me how in fear and loathing they took her to Ecuador because nothing could be found in Colombia that could save her life. To this day, medical attention in Colombia for the poor is deeply deficient. A son of a Kofan with whom I work was left incapacitated because a medical technician thought nothing better than to inject the infant with a needle at the base of its head. I have no doubt that COVID-19 is grossly underreported in rural Colombia. The Kofan are defending themselves against COVID with natural remedies. The lack of adequate health care reflects the government of Colombia's apparent contempt for the Kofan people, but not just them, for all the poor, the vulnerable, the marginalized, the dispossessed. Nor is this contempt limited to health care. It includes what economists call unmet basic needs, such as inadequate infrastructure, deficient education, lacking food security, which turns out to be quite convenient for the government's agenda of export-led growth, i.e. oil. When the Kofan protest an economic project that can adversely impact their well-being and peace, such as a highway cutting through the middle of their land, the government and whatever business consortium is ready to offer the Kofan crumbs in the form of some modest infrastructure, in exchange for their cooperation. This is coupled with local corruption, both from within the communities and of local institutions, and they make for a potent combination. This well-oiled machine counts on both the inaction and complicity of the national government. This well-oiled machine fosters dispossession, disempowerment, denies justice, and ultimately, it does not conceive of respect. I find myself in this place, in this context, because of a booklet where I first read about Yahé. Its author, Richard Evans Schultes, may he rest in peace, a Harvard ethnobotanist who spent years in the Colombian Amazon, mentioned that Yahé was reputed to endow its users with telepathic powers for which he said, quote, "There is, of course, no scientific evidence." And I thought to myself, then why put it? You've got limited real estate in this little booklet. Why put that in? So that little phrase snagged me. So I traveled to the Colombian Amazon in 1986. I was just out of college, and I went looking for this plant. And that's when I met the late Don Pacho, Francisco Piaguaje, may he rest in peace, a Siona Yaibain, a traditional authority of the Siona people, whose territory is on the Putumayo River. My first encounter with Yahé was at once terrifying and deeply empowering. And in retrospect, I recall Dante's crawling down Satan's ankles to re-enter paradise. In between 3 visits in 1986 and my reconnection to this world in 2001, I became a volunteer and then a lobbyist for Amnesty International USA in Washington, D.C. Colombia demanded my constant attention. To give you a sense of the scale, the Colombian government and its paramilitary allies were killing as many people in a year as had been killed in the entire dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet in Chile, 17 years. To this day, the Colombian government is amazing at spin, and most people in the U.S. remain oblivious of the untold horrors in Colombia. I was working at Amnesty when I first traveled to the Guamués River Valley as part of an international mission because of the political violence in the region in July of 1998. Little did I know that I would be returning, and that I did in February 2004, when I first visited Santa Rosa del Guamués. Since that time, I have been to Kofan territory some 60 times. My last visit to the Colombian Amazon was this past March, just before the COVID shutdown. I had left Amnesty in 2001 with the intention of making a documentary about Don Pacho, and ended up working for an NGO working with Amazonian shamans, including the Siona and the Kofan. During which time, right before a ceremony, a group of Siona arrived saying that Don Pacho was deathly ill, and a delegation of shamans and apprentices was promptly dispatched to give aid. All through that night, I thought of the stories Don Pacho had told me so many years ago and despaired at the thought that those memories could be lost. When my tenure at that NGO came to an end, I spun off to videotape the oral history of the elder shamans and their wives. An assembly suggested I begin with the Kofan since they had, quote, the eldest elder, Fernando Mandua, may he rest in peace, who at the time of his death in October of 2007 may have been 120 years of age. Both Taita Pacho and Taita Fernando died the same year, months apart. Both left an indelible mark upon me. I was with Taita Fernando 2 days before he died. 1 day later, we were visiting Taita Pacho's community when we received a call and were told that Taita Fernando had just announced that he would die the next day. And so it came to be. By then I was in deep with the Siona and the Kofan. Things like that always amazed me, but never surprised me. I had learned that to truly engage with them, I had to trust them and surrender completely to them and their medicine. It was the only way they could actually trust me, and that they needed to do. I was capturing one of their last great treasures, their memories. To give you a sense of how delicate this dance was, even though I arrived there with a given that the intellectual property of the video would be theirs, It still took us a year and a half before they agreed to the taping. And yet arriving at the agreement came in the most unexpected way. It all began in an encounter in November of 2004 when they told me that we could not proceed. I was flummoxed. We had 3 previous encounters where not only they had agreed to do it, but some of them had also traveled to Bogota where they approved the video crew I had assembled. And to boot, there were 2 major institutional donors willing to fund the pilot project. Over a couple of days, we discussed this decision, both as a group and in individual chats. But for the life of me, I could not understand the reason for the change of heart. Finally, I approached Curaca Fernando and told him that I did not understand. So I asked him for the truth. By then, I had begun to notice a few things about my interaction with Yahé. One thing I had found is that Yahé would always provide me with an answer, although getting into it would be painful. The answer would be clear, but would usually arrive by the time I had forgotten what my question was. This is what happened to me when I'd been praying the rosary before ceremony, fervently asking for my faith to be strengthened. So at one point, late in ceremony, these ceremonies do run all night and into the morning light, I was lying on my hammock when a voice in my head said, "So then, you believe in God?" And I said, "Yes, of course." "Ah," it replied. "So you believe in God?" "Yes," I replied. It was still. Then it was back. "So you believe in God?" "Yes," I replied curtly. And the question continued, as if emphasizing a different part of the question, as if questioning a different part of my definitions. And the questioning slowly whittled away at what I thought was my belief in God and what my thoughts were about God. Each pass chipped away, and I began to feel a threat. It was destroying a fundamental part of me. Each part made another justification or definition or fallback position fall away into a void. The relentlessness was excruciating. Tears were streaming down my face as I struggled to hold on into my belief in God. But the questioning only increased in intensity until I was crying and clutching my hammock. And as I saw in my mind's eye, I was falling into a deep abyss with all mental justifications, definitions, thoughts, words, anything about God, all being destroyed and whisked into a lot of nothingness. And yet, as I fell into this void, I cried out, "Yes, I believe in God." There was stillness. And the little voice came back and said, "That, my friend, is faith." So in retrospect, asking the most powerful Kofan Curaca, the late great Fernando Mendua, for the truth was about as foolhardy as it gets. For they tell me, not only is the Yahé its own spirit, but the Curaca also adds his spirit into the Yahé when he offers one the cup. This is what they have told me. One part of the ensuing vision was the crucifixion. I felt it. I understood it. I do not recall the depth. I recall that there was great beauty. There was great depth. But what it was, I do not recall. All I am left with is awe. And then also, I felt great pain, at which point I remembered that I had asked for the truth. I meant the truth about what was going on. Little t, not capital T. But the part of that ceremony, which I hope to never forget, was that later on, as I was lying in my hammock, I heard a voice in my head, and I knew it was Fernando. One thing for you to know is that when I say I'm hearing a voice, it's not in an auditory sense, but I am hearing it. And he began, "Carlos, you have come here because you want to do good by us." "Yes, Taita." "Yes, I know that. It is true. It is good." "And you respect us." "Yes, Taita." "Yes, I know. That's true. That is good." "And you fear us." "Yes, Taita, I do fear y'all quite a bit." "Yes, that's true. That's good." And you like us. Of course, Taita, I do like all of you. Yes, that is true. That is also good. And after a moment, the voice said, but you do not love me. He left it open-ended. And then I immediately recalled how earlier in that visit, maybe that day or the day before, I'd seen him spontaneously bleeding from the nose. And to my chagrin, my thought had been, dang, we're not going to get to tape him in time. It hadn't been about, how is he? What's happening? I said, you're right, Taita. I do not love you. And then he said, then how do you expect us to work together if you do not love me? And I said, we can't, Taita. You're right. We can't work if I don't love you. I was at peace. I understood. And the next day, I agreed with the assembly. We couldn't go forward. Not as how we were, but we would continue to meet and see what, if anything, we could salvage. Curaca Fernando told us that during that night's ceremony, he had spoken with God, who had told him that the work as currently configured could not continue. So eventually I returned back to Santa Rosa, and this time the Siona met me there as well. And soon we, the Siona, Kofan, myself, were all having ceremonies together. And yet what ensued over the next few months in ceremony, I can only describe as a catechesis of love. Every ceremony held lessons for me about love, Fernando guiding the way, about finding love in the details, in the creases of the grandmother, in the peals of laughter, and my wife, and my children, and God our Lord. Taita Fernando was teaching me about love. And towards what ended up being the end of this process, one night, in vision, I was before a very dark hallway with massive doors on either side, bolted shut. And the voice said, you cannot walk through here without love, but you must walk with love. And so I began walking through this hallway with love. And as I did, each door burst open as I passed by them, flooding the hallway with bright light. And the voice said, see, with love it is all possible. And as I lay on my hammock contemplating that vision, contemplating this amazing process, Curaca Fernando's voice came again and said to me, Carlos, do you love me? And without hesitation, I replied, sí, Taita, te quiero. And he said, I know, it is good. At dawn, as I stood by the tomadero with Cirilo, one of Fernando's adoptive sons, I saw out of the corner of my eye, Taita Fernando was coming my way, slowly, methodically, in his barefoot way, inexorably, and smiling. And when he got to us, he motioned to me, and Cirilo told me to put out my hands. And when I did, Curaca Fernando deposited 2 yarn strings, which the curacas and grandmothers use. To this day, I don't know exactly what they do with them, but it was a gift. He smiled, and he turned and walked away. Yep, it had happened. It was real. And soon enough, we were signing contracts to protect their intellectual property. We were taping the first interviews with Fernando and so many others in their language about whatever topic they chose to talk about. By the time that the 13th Mobile Brigade of the Colombian Army moved into the Kofan territory to lay claim to a lot sold to them by a colonist, a lot the Ministry of Defense bought with funding from the Colombian oil company Ecopetrol, Curaca Fernando had departed the life of flesh and blood. The Kofanis asked me for help when they first heard about this possibility in 2006 to prevent the army base. No one else would help them. I went off to the side and cried. I did not want to die. I did not want to deal with the Colombian army or their paramilitaries. It's a dirty war, and it continues to this very day. But I also couldn't walk away. The videotaping project was no longer a job. The Kofanis were not just people I worked with. They were people with first and last names. some with archaic Spanish or Roman names, and common last names that identified someone as being Kofan. I knew their foibles, I recognized their laughter. They all laughed at me and called me Carlitos. So I said yes and began helping them get rid of an army base on what turned out to be their land after all. This in turn led us to discover a solid Kofan territorial claim. I learned that their territories had been recognized by the Colombian government in 1973, and its archival history led into our immersion into decades of governmental neglect and abuse and dispossession of the Kofan. We eventually filed suit on behalf of the Kofan territory of Santa Rosa, and we won at the Constitutional Court, despite a lot of irregularities and dirty tricks by the lower courts. And despite this ruling, which was published in 2014, nothing has happened. Let me rephrase that. The government of Colombia has done nothing meaningful to restore the Kofan territorial boundary as ordered by the court. In the meantime, the government has moved its allies against us and against me personally, using corruption to destroy the Santa Rosa community from within. What we face is a sophisticated web of actors from the Interior Ministry, the Defense Ministry, other government agencies, a local indigenous organization which specializes in cheating the Kofan, a national indigenous organization doing the same, members of the Santa Rosa community, all acting in concert with the purpose of disregarding the traditional authorities and describing me, of course, as an odious outsider who is enriching himself at the expense of the Kofan elders. Among the tactics they use are entangling what's already a complex process even more and delegitimizing Kofan practices and customs in the internal governance of Santa Rosa, not to mention the usual rumor-mongering, outright lying, and misrepresentation. But when we point out the many fallacies in our documentation, the Colombian government turns a blind eye and ignores our communication, often repeating the same boilerplate at us. Yet we continue to look for any expression of goodwill by Colombian government officials. The officials could actually stop the extinction of the Kofan people. Every time we encounter such an official, we latch onto them, but Colombia's problems are so many and so deep that it is very hard to keep their attention. You might think that this struggle is impossible to sustain, and I would agree, were it not for God and the ceremony. It is my faith in God and the nourishment that I draw from prayer, coupled with the nourishment and healing I receive during ceremony, that allow me to persist. Many times the Gospels have illuminated the situations I have found myself in. For instance, realizing when questions from a crowd are not aimed at clarifying anything, or when such attacks are to be met simply with silence. Or when I have encountered Jesus in a conversation about prayer with a Kofan child, or in the healing touch of the curacas during ceremony, or even recognizing the hand of angels when my toddler children would give me teddy bears or other dolls to accompany me on my journeys to Colombia. I have faced betrayals from Kofan whom I thought were close friends and dependable bulwarks, who have turned against me and against the curacas, and we continually face the injustice of an unresponsive system. You would think from all this that our gatherings are bitter, somber affairs. And while we discuss these events, they can be. But we never stop thanking God for the fact that we're gathered, for our struggle, for the fact that we can struggle, and we enjoy many and frequent outbursts of joyous laughter. A passerby walking by our gatherings would think that it's a group of crazy people, silent, then joyous laughter, then silent again. And yes, these are social gatherings of the best kind. So much more. We're gathering people from 5 different territories. I believe that these gatherings are our modest effort at recognizing, if not outright building, the kingdom. So I'd like to take advantage of sharing this work with you to ask that you pray for us. And should you have any ideas or advice, suggestions, please send them my way. I would like to count on you as a partner in our struggle for a more just world, and I'm open to any suggestions you may have on how we can make this a living, breathing relationship. Thanking God the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, I thank each and every one of you. May God always bless you. Thank you. Amen.